back, and we're very honored to have as a special guest today Nathan Robinson. You know him as editor-in-chief of the excellent Current Affairs magazine. Nathan, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, David. Hey, Matt. Nice to be back with you.
Yeah, man, it's really great to have you. And last time we had you on the program, took a deep dive into Chomsky. People should be picking up that book now because it's out. Don't forget.
Yeah, Myth of American Idealism. It's out. It's good.
It's been really great seeing the responses to that book, Nathan. But we're not talking about heroes today. We might be talking more about villains.
Going the opposite end here.
The anti-Chomsky.
I mean, we got to talk about Matt Yglesias, and I mean, we have a few specific things we want to get into. You have an excellent piece in Current Affairs, which is a link below for people to read. I want to get into some of the specifics about Matt Yglesias. But Nathan, why is he somebody worth paying attention to in the first place?
Well, hang on a minute, because I dispute the premise of that question. He is not someone worth paying attention to in the first place. But the fact is that he is paid attention to. And so I have to pay attention to people who are not worth paying attention to, but are paid attention to. And Matt Yglesias is paid attention to by some pretty high profile people. In fact, it turns out that he was one of the most followed. His newsletter was tied for the most followed newsletter by members of the Biden transition team. He meets with members of Congress. He is very well placed in D.C. He has the ear of prominent Democrats, and in fact, he had the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, just called him up, for a chit chat, and he'd even had a conversation, a private conversation with Joe Biden. We don't even know what they talk about. So this is a pundit, and usually we don't want to pay attention to pundits who just spew vacuous opinions for a living. But the fact is that this man is apparently taken very seriously by prominent Democrats. So you got to deal with him.
I mean, I got to say, I think some people might be forgetting, about the Vox years, when that really seemed the way that media and at least punditry was going. But, I can look at somebody like Ezra Klein, and I remember Ezra Klein was the health policy guy. But Yglesias really, his politics are a little bit harder to pin down. I mean, how would you categorize him for somebody who might not have sort of read or interacted with his work before?
Well, there's one way of describing what he puts out, which is that he appears to wake up each day and think, what is the most irritating opinion that I can possibly have today? Because as you say, his politics are a little hard to pin down. He describes himself as center-left, as a center-left Democrat. I think the left part, I don't see as much evidence of, although, he advocates some social democratic policies in his book, 1 Billion Americans, which is very bad and I don't recommend reading. He does, in fact, say that with our 1 billion Americans, we're going to build kind of a good welfare state. So he is he's roughly a centrist Democrat. He's a YIMBY. If people don't know about the YIMBYs, they are, that stands for Yes in My Backyard. And they're basically people who are pro-development and pro-developer, who believe that the response to the housing crisis in the United States is we just need to build a lot more housing, which they often advocate should come about through deregulation. That's roughly the position. So he's very big on that. He's a little bit, I would describe him as a little hawkish in the foreign policy domain. He was in favor of the Iraq War, although he now realizes what a catastrophic mistake that was. He's I'm not a climate change denier, but someone who I feel downplays the significance and doesn't care that much about climate change. So you can go through every different issue and see what his position is, because it varies, but roughly a centrist Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
How much of his acting out do you think is an ass covering exercise? Because not only you mentioned the billion Americans, that's not really something he's leaning on. You should have listened to me and we should have done a billion Americans. And also his newsletter, when the Washington Post cites his newsletter as being read by Biden, the thing that the article that they pointed to, they said especially his view on the Build Back Better negotiations. And my recollection of that piece was cave to mansion and cinema. Perhaps that's a little bit uncharitable, but do you think he's like kind of covering his ass a little bit right now?
What do you mean by covering his ass?
Like, he has been listened to by a president who turned out to be massively unpopular, and now he has to sell himself under a new sort of regime and try to his like what is the use of Matt Yglesias for the next 4 years?
It's true that, in fact, if you go, it can be hard to keep track of what these guys have said because someone like him, they spew out. I mean, I'm kind of similar. This is a bit hypocritical to say, but they spew out so many words that you can lose track of what they said like a month ago. As writing this article, I was like only able to go back through like a couple months of his tweets and writings because after that, the volume was too immense. But it is true that during the campaign, Harris, his advice, Iglesias' advice to Kamala Harris was basically she needed to run to the center. And if she wanted to win, she needed to run as a centrist. She needed to run as, not anti-immigrant, but pro-border security. He's also advised that Democrats need to ditch gun control as an issue. He certainly doesn't think that Palestine is important. And Harris did run to the center. This is precisely what she did. She basically followed what the Yglesias playbook would be, and she got creamed. She lost. She lost very badly. And so now he's, as you say, he's kind of coming out and with all these like why I was actually right in a certain way kind of takes, but when really like he should go away. This should be the moment where he is embarrassed by the fact that he was so wrong, and he should leave. He should leave the public discourse for a while and go off and reflect and read some things and think about why he was so wrong.
And I think that's one thing I really liked about your piece here is that because I think you highlighted and noted something very particular and important about Iglesias' like public persona, particularly in how it relates to the left, which is that he represents a character who says, hey, the left might feel good. It might feel good to be on the left, but they basically are just whiners who don't want to look at the facts, and the cold hard facts tell a different story. But by going through his pieces, I think that you make a very compelling argument that he actually might not be somebody who's actually looking at the cold-hearted facts. And like maybe to get us started, I mean, he wrote this horrendous piece back in the 2010s. I remember this being a reason that I hated him back in the good old days about this factory fire in Bangladesh, where he basically argued that, hey, it's probably okay that American companies are contracting work out to these factories and people are dying. And it's okay that these American companies are doing this and they have lax workers protection regulations because different countries need different kinds of regulations to be able to build up an economy. And I've always found that to be, a very, very disgusting and nasty response to, a serious disaster.
Yeah, this is probably the most infamous thing he's written, which was for Slate back over 10 years ago, as you say. And, 1,000 workers in Bangladesh had died in this factory collapse. And, he came out and basically said, actually, not that this is good, but it's good that there weren't more safety regulations because, as you say, Bangladesh needs to build up its economy and they wouldn't be as attractive to employers if they had safe workplaces. So it's okay that they have unsafe workplaces. And first off, there's just a kind of grotesque insensitivity to you see that incident and that's your instinct is to go, I'm going to go right at my Slate pitch, my counterintuitive column about why actually all the people who this really upsets, who are really disturbed at this tragedy, like you need to understand that the tragedy was economically a necessity almost. Not quite clear, like, what he's arguing. Like, is it we should just accept that this happens and we shouldn't be upset by it? And there's something that runs through his work. It's kind of on its most extreme display there. But I point out that often there's just this lack of empathy. There's this weird, like, oh, all you people who are upset by some horrible thing, you know, you're emotional, you're hysterical, you need to be Mr. Logic and Facts Man like me, and Mr. Logic and Facts Man sees why we need to actually do the thing that you think is horrible. I single out his writings on Palestine for this because I think that there is a real clear example where it's not just that he's not pro-Palestine, it's that he treats those who are upset by the mass killings as, at one point, like, mentally ill, like, suggesting that, like, to be extremely disturbed by it is, like, evidence that there's something wrong with you. And that's the sort of thing where it's like, what you're calling being Mr. Logic and Facts guy, to me, is sociopathy.
Yeah, you do a good job in the piece at, you know, a real Mr. Logic and Facts guy would look at a statement like, they object to a Jewish state, and look at, like, well, what premises are embedded in a concept like a Jewish state? For instance, like exclusion and transfer of a population already there. Like, that's what a real logic guy would do. But again, he's just like pathologizing people for, I mean, that's the other thing about Yglesias, is I don't know how much this is just his desire to piss people off and what he sincerely believes about any of it.
Well, I mean, I go through examples where where he pretends that he is taking the issue more seriously than the emotional, hysterical people, but actually is the one who is excluding inconvenient facts and evidence and not analyzing the issue seriously. So, for instance, you know, he argued that Israel was waging a just war in Gaza, and he said that critics are overlooking the extent to which the humanitarian disaster is an inevitable consequence of waging war in a place with the population density of Philadelphia or Chicago. And he said it's not like Israel is avoiding military targets in favor of shelling a city or deliberately targeting a civilian population center. Okay, but we have a ton of reports saying that Israel has been targeting civilians or has at the very least, like, deliberately adjusted their standards to allow for just levels of collateral damage that are just kind of unprecedented. Air Wars just had I believe it was Air Wars that just came out with this new analysis comparing, you know, to other conflicts and saying that the civilian deaths in this conflict really are on a level unlike anything else we've seen in the 21st century, even like Russia in Ukraine, even like the United States in Iraq. We know that Israel was depending on this, like, AI targeting algorithm, and they believed that if they could get one high value Hamas target, it could be worth, like, killing hundreds and hundreds of civilians to get that target. And there's a bunch of evidence. There are tons and tons of human rights reports about what Israel has been doing in Gaza that if you are a rational and serious person, you can't just pretend they don't exist. You have to deal with them. You have to respond to them. You have to rebut them.
That's the report, Matt?
Yeah, I just put up the report there. That was the Air Wars Patterns of Harm Analysis.
No, I mean, you know, there's that. He really, to paraphrase Christopher Hitchens, he says he really seems like somebody who has never read the arguments of somebody against his position ever. As you noted in your piece, particularly on Palestine. I mean, just tremendously ignorant on what people who are pro-Palestinian or just pro-human rights generally have argued today and in the past.
Well, I mean, I give the example of the fact that he when he dismisses what is called the one-state solution, he says, and I'll just quote him, he says that the advocates of the one-state solution seem to put exactly zero effort into trying to figure out the logistical details of how it's supposed to work. And then I recommend, you know, a book by Ali Abumino, The Electronic Intifada, who literally wrote a very detailed book which is about how populations, different nations in a single space can come together under a single government, right? So he looks at European examples, right? He looks at the resolution of Ireland, right? Of the troubles in Ireland. So he goes through and tries to find models for how the Israel-Palestine conflict could be resolved without two states, with one state, two peoples. And you can say that you're not persuaded by Ali's analysis, but you can't just pretend it's not there if you're a serious person who's interested in the facts. And that's what just enrages me about Yglesias, the level of arrogance and disdain for the left, despite not even picking up the book to write a rebuttal. It's just so, I mean, there's just something so deeply obnoxious about that level of confidence mixed with that level of ignorance.
What do you think it says about our body politic that there's a demand for Yglesias style, hacketry?
I mean, well, it doesn't say anything particularly good or encouraging, but there's a lot of figures that where I think, wow, the popularity of that person really doesn't speak well for the state of our political discourse, right? So, like, when the New York Times said that Ben Shapiro was the cool kid's philosopher, I thought, God, is that the state of public philosophy today? Or when, like, the leading interviewers are people like Joe Rogan and Lex Friedman who don't do any research or, like, before interviewing people, and then they interview people who just bullshit. It disturbs me that, like, these are the most popular, the leading interviewers, and Joe Rogan's like, tell me more about the evidence for Atlantis. And then he's like, whoa. And then I just, like, so Yglesias is not unique in this respect. There are a lot of ways in which you look at the figures who are pushing, who are leading, who are thought leaders. You look at the thought leaders in our country, and you think, but there is no thought there. They're not thinking.
Well, I mean, you know, he I think I agree with you about the similarities here, but, like, I think one of the big differences between, like, Yglesias and Rogan and even in Friedman is that, like, you know, it is people like in DC who like to consume Yglesias, and you know, a lot of his work, particularly recently, has been these kind of defenses of, like, the Biden's political failures, right? You know, like 2020, there was this kind of moment where it felt like maybe the Democratic Party was going to move in a different direction, and there were pretty fierce debates going on within the party. And Yglesias regularly stood on the side of, you know, no, we got to return to the old consensus, the neoliberal model's best, and ran cover for it. And now, I think very clearly, when that's been repudiated by the voters, he's coming up with this kind of way of trying to blame the left again, even though he was the guy who is being read and influencing the figures in power.
Yeah, you did this. The Biden presidency, like, this is your people. This is not, there's all this effort to brand Joe Biden as having run this kind of, like, you know, the myth was that Biden was the new FDR.
The reluctant FDR, right? You know?
From 2021, right? And that he practiced this kind of politics they call deliverism, where you deliver for ordinary people. And then people like Yglesias coming out, well, I guess deliverism didn't work. We delivered for the American people, and they just didn't want it. They didn't want us to deliver for them. And I just go, like, where was that? Like, because in the world that I live in, like, there's homeless encampments all across this city, like, where you haven't fixed anything. All of the problems that were there 4 years ago, like, they're still here, and people are still experiencing them in their lives.
And
yeah, the way that's emphasized, it says it all, that we delivered for them. You never hear a working person say, yeah, you delivered for us, and we're still going for Trump.
We delivered for you, and we don't care what you think about it. We delivered for you no matter what your impressions of that are.
Here's a graph that says, your life's going well, friend. You know what I mean? Which is a lot of
Well, you don't understand math? You don't get math? Look at it.
And I think that, you know, I think Yglesias and I think a lot of people around him have a really disgusting view of Americans. I mean, I was listening to him, I think on the Bulwark podcast, debating Tyler Harper Austin recently on, you know, his politics. And I mean, you know, Yglesias's point now is that basically the Democratic Party got too friendly to the LGBTQ movement, and they need to get a little bit more homophobic, right? Disgusting in its own way, but it's also disgusting to, one, make that argument, but to, two, genuinely believe it in the way that he does. And I think that there's a really offensive aspect to Yglesias's worldview, which is that, like, Americans are just kind of like bigoted pigs, right? Who don't understand what's good for them. And we basically have to trick them into supporting us, right? That is like the Iglesian like politics, is that we got to put up something big and sparkly that inspires people, and then we can do the real stuff that people don't like, sort of in the shadows. At least that's what his new pivot seems to be from that debate that I was listening to earlier this week.
Yeah, there is a certain there is a lack of faith in the American people that there is like a view that they are this inherently right-wing and irrational people, and you have to just take them at that. And I think he's the same with the stuff on gun control, where first off, it often ignores all the public polling that suggests the opposite, right? I mean, he says, like, for example, when he's talking about healthcare, first off, he thinks the American healthcare system works well, which I don't know that anyone agrees with him on that. But there's just there's this ignoring of the actual polls that tell us what the American people really think, and this very strange view that you have to kind of mislead them. This whole idea of which direction you should run to, like run to the left, run to the center, suggests that you're literally like doing calculated dishonesty. Whereas like my perspective is that you should hold the values that you hold, and you should advocate the policies you believe are good, and then you should figure out, how do I convince people to support those things? And some of the stuff is already going to be publicly popular, and some of the stuff isn't. And if it turns out that like trans rights isn't popular, well, then you have work to do. Then you have a civil rights movement to wage. Like that's, I mean, the 90s were horrible for public opinion on gay rights. And there was a movement, and your job as a moral human being is to not measure by what you think the electorate believes, right? But to say, like, what is right, what is just. You have to make some political calculations as to how far you think you can go right now. But yeah, there's this, there really is this kind of amoral core. I mean, he says, I quote him in the piece saying, people have accused me of being a soulless monster who doesn't believe in anything. But I do feel like, I do get that impression. I do get that, like, lack of empathy, lack of commitment, lack of passion. It's disturbing.
Well, let's get on the personal level for a second before we get back into what he represents. Matt, do we have this tweet here? I mean, this is somebody who has a lack of empathy, in my opinion. This is one of his former coworkers, Sarah Kogod, who you noted in your piece, saying, quote, Matt Yglesias once justified his refusal to wash his own dishes in the shared work kitchen by explaining that his salary versus the office assistant's hourly pay meant that it was more economical for our company to have her wash his dishes than for him to do it. Which I think really does expose, not only is this guy kind of like a nuisance publicly and politically, but he's not the kind of guy that I would want to, share an office with, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But there's this in that there is this kind of, I don't want to make a psychological diagnosis. I can't conclude that he's a sociopath. I don't know. I've never met him. I've never analyzed him. But there is, throughout his work, and it is consistent with that anecdote, this bizarre lack of empathy, lack of solidarity, tone deafness. I mean, he might wonder why people... What's annoying is that he sort of treats people's bad reactions to him as evidence that they haven't listened or read him carefully, when it's actually evidence that he's just behaved like an asshole and they have responded accordingly. But like the concept of being an asshole doesn't register with him, like the concept of like, actually maybe it's a really unpleasant thing to do to describe someone upset about the war in Gaza as being mentally ill, or maybe it's a really unpleasant thing to do to go up to someone who's upset about a factory collapse and go, well, actually, like, don't you understand like what kind of person that makes you seem?
No, I mean, totally. And I mean, people probably saw recently he got a lot of flack for some of his DoorDash or Uber Eats receipts and people finding out how little this guy tips. I will just say from personal experience, I used to bartend in DC, and him and the Vox team would come in a lot. And I'll just, put it plainly on the table for folks. Guy was always wearing a Vox t-shirt, was regularly like covered in stains. And he would sit at the bar and everyone else would have a drink, and nothing wrong with people who aren't drinking, but he would never get it. He would get like a Sprite or a soda water or whatever, and would constantly like be like, hey, I need another, I need another, I need another, and then would order maybe like like an appetizer or something, be there for like 3-4 hours, and would leave literally like $1 or like 50 cents change on the thing, which I just find to be really despicable behavior. So it is a little personal for me on this, but I think it really does. I think that you can see it both on some of these kind of personal stories, right, which only means so much, to these other things that like, no, there is a kind of like sickness to this worldview. And, I want to say something like aggrievement, but I don't even know what it is particularly that he's aggrieved by, because like he's somebody who's done very well in American society. He's somebody who does very well in the media politically. I mean, he has a major political party that sort of represents his political philosophy.
Well, I mean, he's had a charmed life, right? But because his father was a novelist, right? So he grew up in comfort. Incidentally, his grandfather is I don't know about his novels, but I've just been reading his grandfather's books, and his grandfather is an amazing writer. His grandfather wrote a book about the Cuban Revolution called "In the Fist of the Revolution" that I've just read, and he's a left-leaning person. It's a very sympathetic and warm and humane book. He also wrote a book about Spain under Franco called "The Franco Years," that is very good. And to me, it gives Matt Yglesias even less of an excuse, because it's like, oh, you had in your family, you had all the advantages. Literally, your grandfather, like you could have picked up his books in the house when you were young. You could have learned like a warm and empathetic and they even say in the book jacket on the Franco book, it says like, Yglesias's empathetic approach has become like so well known that it's described as the Yglesias touch. Like, this is Jose Yglesias, and it's like, well, I'm sorry, but little do you know that someday your grandson will ruin the family name and what the Yglesias touch is. So he lived a charmed life. He went to Harvard, right? He was a blogger straight out of college and just immediately very successful, and is now very rich, and his Substack makes over $1 million a year. Like he's had this fantastic life, and yet it's so nasty.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I know you don't have a crystal ball there, but I'm curious. Do you think that somebody like, I don't know. I mean, I've been doing this. I think we've all been doing this for a little while, both writing and talking about these folks. There was a real like hot period, I think, for these kind of like new, scrappy, blogger turned, more professional, journalists out there, the Vox folks, Yglesias, etc. You think that there's still going to be a market for these guys, or do you think that they're sort of like trying to defend their territory at this point?
Yeah, not really. I don't think so, because I mean, his Substack is going to keep making $1 million a year forever, but I don't think he's going to grow his audience very much. I don't think anybody really. I mean, first off, I wrote that article, but I was hesitant to write that article because normally I write articles when I write these big critical pieces. I try and write about people who do have a huge audience, people like Ben Shapiro, people like Joe Rogan. And Matt Yglesias, I was almost like, do enough people even care? And I ultimately came to the resolution that, well, no, but enough people who matter in DC care, right? So he's influential in a certain small circle. But those people have been totally discredited by the catastrophic Kamala Harris campaign, by essentially handing all three branches of government over to the right wing. Who wants to listen to him anymore? Who is his audience? People are fleeing like MSNBC, right? The ratings have been collapsing since the election. And I think there's an intuitive sense that people like him have very little of value to say in this moment.
I mean, again, I really do think his value for those folks is just like, you're doing a great job. He is really just like a mirror that presents a good image for people in positions of power. And
bedtime stories.
Yeah. I don't know. I'd like to think that it's over, but I hope that, more importantly, regardless of if he has an income or not, is not of much interest to me. But it does make me happier to realize that I think less and less normal people are engaging with these folks as serious thinkers, because I think they've really exposed themselves.
Well, and I think it's dangerous if people do take these people seriously, because I mean, one of the issues that I point to in the piece is the way that Yglesias writes about climate, because he was very much on the he didn't think Kamala was pro-fracking enough during the campaign. And, Kamala Harris ran a campaign that was very explicit about downplaying the salience of climate as an issue, that really pushed heavily the all-of-the-above approach, which includes expanding American fossil fuel production. And when you read Yglesias' pieces on climate change, they just don't take the warnings of climate scientists very seriously. They don't engage with, and he was protested actually he had an event disrupted by climate activists, and he just laughed at them. He was just Then it's well, okay, but no, this is a serious issue, and he's the kind of person who is telling people they don't need to worry about it, or that it's just not worth major new pushes to do anything about. And I mean, I obviously think that's very, very dangerous, and that someone like him encourages Democrats to inhabit the world of centrist delusion, where you don't have to do transformative changes. Things will just be fine. We'll just keep making little incremental steps towards a better world, and there's not going to be any crisis. And you can just go on living your comfortable life, and yeah, and you don't need to take the concerns of someone like Bernie Sanders, who's actually, okay, no, things are very deeply fucked up and we need to do something serious about them. You can just sort of wave those away as those people are immature and childish and they don't understand real politics.
I mean, I think just temperamentally, the kind of politics that he presents are just so poisonous for the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party, I think one of their biggest issues that's been really exposed is that as more and more Americans are saying, I'm really angry about what's going on in the world and in my life. Yeah. The Democrats are completely incapable of harnessing any of that energy, even when they might be right about an argument here or there versus a Republican, let's say. They're incapable of doing it. And as somebody who lived in DC, I mean, Yglesias really represented a whole class of folks. I mean, I had to leave DC to be able to have real political conversations for the most part, because your average conversation with somebody at a bar was always going to be if you were ever to be upset about something or passionate about something, you were sort of seen as a fool, right? Who doesn't understand how politics really works, because politics is about being detached from these kind of things. And yeah, I mean, I think spiritually, philosophically, these things these guys are very dangerous people to listen to. Yeah.
He's really just a Pangloss, from Voltaire's Candide. The quote, "These things cannot be otherwise than as they are." But yeah, Nathan, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah.
People should subscribe to Current Affairs.
I agree.
A great article. I mean, the South Africa piece in this recent edition was just, I think, a really good treatment of the whole white genocide paranoia. So yeah, if people aren't, go subscribe to Current Affairs. Anything else you want to plug? Oh, the Chomsky book.
Oh yeah, Myth of American Idealism is in bookstores now. This was, I worked with Professor Chomsky to edit together, to put together this really powerful summary statement of his critique of U.S. foreign policy, and I think I'm really proud of what we pulled off with that book. I think it hits hard. It's a bleak read, but I hope as many people as possible read it, because it's designed to introduce his really powerful critique to a new generation of readers.
Yeah, pick it up, friends. We have a link below to all that stuff. Nathan, as always, thank you for hanging out with us.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Matt. I enjoyed it.